again to Mark 15, and we'll read for the final time in this communion season the passage that we've been studying over the course of this fortnight. Mark 15, and we'll read verses 33 to 41. Mark 15, and we read from verse 33. We break into the passion narrative of Christ being nailed to the cross, 9 o'clock in the morning, and we break in now at noon. Verse 33. When the 6th hour had come, that's midday, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he's calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way, he breathed his last, he said, Truly, this man was the Son of God. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James the younger and of Joses, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Amen. We end there at verse 41 and pray again that God would open our eyes to the wonder of this little passage. Please keep that open as again we look at it for the final time over the course of our communion season. As you know, over these past 2 Sabbath days, as we've been coming again to think and prepare and then sit at the Lord's table, we have been focusing our attention on these verses, verse 33 to 41 of Mark 15. We looked at our pre-communion service at the darkness that covered the land from the 6th to the 9th hour. This morning we looked at Christ's cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? We thought of the distraction that Christ was to the bystanders. He was nothing to them other than a form of entertainment. The devotion shown to Christ by the women around the cross. The declaration by the centurion, truly, this man was the Son of God. And this evening, in our Thanksgiving service, as we draw this communion season to a close, we're looking at the depiction that's provided by the torn curtain in verses 37 and 38. The picture that God gives us in this torn curtain, a picture of what God has accomplished in and through the death of his Son. Mark writes in verse 37 and 38, Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Taking place, coinciding with the exact moment of Christ's death, God breaking into events once again in another act of his sovereign intervention, ripping through this huge curtain from top to bottom at the very moment of Christ's death. This miracle is clearly designed to tell us something. And that's what we're thinking about this evening. What God is saying through this miracle, the tearing apart of this curtain in the temple. And we're going to look at this miracle using the same headings that we used in our pre-communion sermon. The miracle, the meaning, and me. We saw in that cosmic darkness, didn't we? In our pre-communion service, we saw that asymmetry in God's work. That cosmic darkness that accompanied the first Passover And again, a cosmic darkness that accompanied the final Passover, connecting these two. And so, replicating that symmetry, we're going to use the same headings that we used in our pre-communion service for this, our Thanksgiving service. The miracle, the meaning, and the me. The application of this miracle to us this evening. Firstly, the miracle. The miracle. Now, maybe you're skeptical. You're sitting here this evening and you have your doubts. You're thinking to yourself, a miracle? Really? I don't think so. What miracle is it? There's a simple, rational explanation for this curtain being torn. It was an old, moth-eaten curtain that was gradually falling apart, and it just so happened that the final threads holding it together came apart at this exact moment in time. Or maybe someone with a grudge against the Jews, for there are many people who have grudges against the Jews, entered the temple and tore this curtain in the precious temple of the Jews. How can you say, Nathan, with certainty that this is a miracle? Well, this was no ordinary curtain. You know, like the curtains, you'll go home and you'll draw. Maybe you drew before you left for church this evening, curtains in your bedroom, the curtains in your living room. This is no ordinary curtain like your curtains at home. When Mark says that the curtain of the temple was torn in two, the curtain he's referring to is not a curtain that was drawn across the temple to keep the light out. The curtain that he's referring to is the curtain that we read of in Exodus chapter 40 that hung between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The most holy place, the most sacred place in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. Curtain that stopped people from going into that most holy place, the Holy of Holies. And remember that this temple was the temple that had been expanded. It had been refurbished at vast expense by King Herod. The temple that we know was covered from head to toe with white marble and gold. The travelers to Jerusalem could see from many miles away, dazzled them from many miles away. The temple that the disciples had gawked at in Mark 13, saying to Christ, what wonderful buildings. What amazing buildings. A temple whose furnishings and implements were made to reflect the grandeur of this refurbished building and the grandeur of its purpose. A building that was looked after by a host of zealous priests and Levites who were dedicated to the worship of the temple, the care of the temple, the elevation in the minds of the people who came to the temple, to elevate in their minds the wonder of the temple. There's no way these curators of the temple would have allowed this particularly special curtain at the very center of the worship of the temple to fall into disrepair. It would not have happened. If there'd been even the slightest indication there was something out of place with this special curtain, the temple attendants would have made sure it was put right immediately. Now think of something that you have, a possession that you have, that you take particular care of. Every time you take it out, you make sure it is put back in as pristine condition as it was when you took it out. Across the road from where my grandfather and grandmother used to live in Ballyclare, there was a man who every time he took out his car, no matter how far he went, he washed the inside, he washed the outside, he hoovered the inside, and he lifted the bonnet and he polished under the bonnet every time he took his car out. That's how these people cared for the temple. That's how these people cared for the temple. This was no old, worn curtain that fell apart in disrepair. Okay, you see? Maybe it didn't fall apart, it wasn't fallen into disrepair and crumbled at the touch of one of the priests. So maybe it was torn apart by someone with a grudge against the Jews. You know, a radical pagan who chose this Friday before the Passover, a particularly sacred day for the Jews. He took it upon himself to enter the temple and destroy, to do something sacrilegious to their precious temple and their precious curtain. That's what happened. Well, quite frankly, that's impossible. Impossible. When we think of curtains again, we think of our curtains at home, maybe 3 or 4 meters high by 3 or 4 meters wide, and only a few millimeters thick, easily cut with a knife or with a pair of kitchen scissors. The curtain in the temple was 60 feet high and 30 feet wide, about 18 meters tall, we're told. 9 meters wide. To put that in context, I brought a tape measure tonight and measured the church building. 7 meters wide, 14 meters long. That, the curtain of the temple was 2 meters wider than this building and about 5 meters longer than this building. That's the size of this curtain as it hung in the temple. And the Jewish records say it was about 4 inches thick, not 4 millimeters thick, 4 inches. That thick, this curtain. It would have been impossible for someone to tear this curtain in two. To attempt such a feat would have required someone to get access to the holy place where only priests, only Levites were allowed to go. They would have had to enter the holy place with quite a big ladder, an extremely big ladder, 60 foot tall this was. Set up the ladder, climb the ladder, and then begin hacking at the precious temple curtain. Anyone attempting such a sacrilege would have been set upon immediately by the priests. It would be impossible on an ordinary day for anyone to do this to the temple curtain, but certainly not on the day before the Passover Sabbath, when the temple courts were thronged with people coming to worship God. The tearing apart of the temple curtain wasn't the result of disrepair. It wasn't the result of someone intent on criminal damage. It was God. It was God intervening in his world in another act of sovereign power. The miracle. That brings us secondly to the meaning. The meaning. Okay, it's a miracle. So what's the meaning of this miracle? What is God saying in it? Well, as I said earlier, before we read from Exodus, in order to understand the meaning of this miracle, what's God saying in tearing this curtain apart, we need to understand why God commanded this curtain to be in the temple in the first place. And very simply, the curtain was a symbol of our separation from God because of our sin and our need for a substitute to bear the punishment for our sin to enable us to have access once more to God. The temple curtain was a symbol of our separation from God because of our sin and our need for a substitute. That's what the temple curtain was there to symbolize. It hung, as I said, over the entrance to the Holy of Holies, this room at the very center of the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. This symbol, a physical, visible symbol of the presence of God, where God on occasions, as we read off in Exodus 40, where God on occasions physically presenced himself with his people, in the midst of his people. And this thick, 4-inch thick, heavy curtain covered the entrance, that Holy of Holies, preventing people from coming into this place that symbolized and on occasions housed the presence of God. It was a place into which God said people could not come. And he ordered this curtain to be hung over the entranceway to keep people out. Why? Why couldn't people just wander into the Holy of Holies, this most holy place? Why did God command that this curtain be hung over the entranceway to keep people out? Well, we're given the answer to this question in the one person who was allowed to enter this most holy place once a year, the high priest. We read often in Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, the high priest was able to go into the presence of God in the Holy of Holies once a year, but only after having offered a sacrifice for his sin. The Holy of Holies was a place into which people couldn't go because of their sin. Our sin is the reason why we cannot go into the presence of God. Sinful people cannot come into the presence of a holy God without being consumed by his just and righteous and holy anger. That's why God commanded this curtain to be placed over the Holy of Holies. And the high priest, again, parting the curtain once a year, whether there was a parting in the curtain or whether he opened it and he went round the side, in behind it, and entering into the Holy of Holies, it pictures again how sinful men and women can come into the presence of God. How? Through the death of a substitute in their place. There he was, and he was dressed in his robes, and he was prepared, trembling to go into the presence of a holy God. What did he do? He went to the altar and he offered a sacrifice to atone for his sin. And his sin having been atoned for, having been punished, in that substitute, he took the blood and he entered into the presence of God through the means of that atoning sacrifice. That's, in a nutshell, what this curtain symbolizes. Our separation from God because of our sin and our need for a substitute to take the punishment for our sin before we can come into God's presence. That heavy curtain, huge, 18 meters by 9 meters, 4-inch, thick, heavy curtain proclaimed to the Jews every day, you cannot come in to the presence of God because of your sin. Your sin prevents you from enjoying the presence of God. In order to enter into his presence, your sin needs to be dealt with through a substitute. And now, suddenly, at 3 o'clock on this particular Friday afternoon, the curtain that God had commanded be placed over the entrance to the Holy of Holies, preventing people from entering his presence, this curtain proclaiming man's inability to enter his presence because of our sin, proclaiming our need for a substitute to bear the punishment for our sin in our place if we're ever going to be able to enter into his holy presence. God reaches down from heaven and he rips this curtain in two. Picture in your mind's eye the priests standing there in the holy place, standing there before this massive curtain suddenly torn in two, and they can see straight into the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant sitting there. And even if they chose to, they could have walked straight in. The curtain that previously said keep out and barred their way into the Holy of Holies was no longer there. Now, what was God saying in that? What was God saying in that? He was saying, the way is now open. The way is now open. It's now possible for you, sinners that you are, to come into my presence. The substitute that you needed to bear the punishment for your sin, the substitute that all those animal sacrifices, year after year after year of animal sacrifices pointed to, the substitute has now come. The mediator who would offer the perfect sacrifice, the mediator pictured for you by the priests, the perfect mediator has now come and offered the perfect sacrifice. And your sin having been dealt with by this sacrifice, this once and for all sacrifice in your place, the sacrifice of the perfect substitute, that sacrifice being offered to God by a perfect mediator, the way is now open for you to come into my presence and enjoy my presence without being consumed by my wrath. That very simply is what he was saying. And the curtain, remember we read verse 37, it's logical, verse 38 comes immediately after verse 37. Verse 37 says, Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and that very moment, as he died, at that very moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. That curtain, huge curtain, been miraculously ripped in half at that very moment that Christ died, cried out and breathed his last. God was pointing to Jesus as the perfect sacrifice and the perfect mediator who had just offered that perfect sacrifice in his death. Tearing the curtain asunder, at that very moment of his son's death, God was saying, this is the death. This is the death, the once and for all sacrifice that opens the way into my presence, that makes it possible for sinners to be with me. He is the one. There's a big finger pointing at Jesus saying, he is the one. It's his death that makes it possible. And that very simply, in a nutshell, is the meaning of this miracle. The curtain that symbolized our separation because of our sin and our need for a substitute, that curtain being wrenched apart by the almighty hand of God, symbolized that the way was now open for sinners like ourselves to come into God's presence, our sin having been dealt with once and for all through the perfect once and for all sacrifice of the Son of God. The meaning. The miracle, the meaning. Finally, the application. Me. What does this miracle have to say to you and to I and I this evening as we sit here in God's house? Well, if you're not a Christian, firstly, we'll speak to those who aren't Christians this evening. If you're not a Christian, this miracle says that the way into God's presence is through Jesus and his sacrifice for sin. And unless and until you put your faith in Jesus and his death in the place of sinners, you're still outside the curtain. You're still outside the curtain. And if you die without having put your faith in Jesus, you'll spend eternity outside the curtain, outside the Holy of Holies, outside the heavenly presence of God. That's what this miracle says to those of you who aren't Christians this evening. The glorious heavenly presence of God. The wonder and glory and joy of being in his presence, face to face with him in heaven, enjoying perfect, unbroken, soul-satisfying relationship with him. But between you and that all-satisfying presence of God will be the thickest, most impenetrable curtain. We have blackout curtains in our bedroom through which the sun does not shine. It'll be the most glorious of sunny days, and we're in complete blackness, complete darkness. Well, for those of you who aren't believers, if you die without putting your faith in Jesus, between you and that glorious, all-satisfying presence of God will be the thickest, most impenetrable of blackout curtains. Curtain that is so thick that you will not be able to pass through it, and through which none of the light and the glory of God's presence will be able to shine upon you. And you'll spend eternity separated, shut out from his presence in the outer darkness that we looked at last Sabbath morning, the outer darkness that God calls hell, experiencing the punishment you justly deserve for your sin. And those Old Testament Jews, picture those Old Testament Jews standing there in the holy place before the curtain, shut out from the Holy of Holies in the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. Those Old Testament Jews, that's a picture for you this evening of what your eternity will be like. Shut out from the presence of God for eternity. But wonderfully and so graciously in this miracle, God provides, he shows you how he's made it possible for you to be in his presence through the death of his Son, by simply trusting in his death, the death in which he suffered, the punishment for sin, the punishment for your sin, if you would but put your trust in him, so that you can be forgiven and have access into this glorious, blinding presence of God. An access that you can enjoy, yes, in this lifetime, a wonderfully satisfying, soul-satisfying relationship with God you can enjoy with him in this lifetime, and a presence you'll bask in, delight in for eternity in heaven when you die. That's the application this evening for those of you who aren't believers. But what does this miracle have to say to those of us who are Christian? What does it have to say to us this evening? Well, at its most basic, it means that the temple worship that's described in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, it's no longer necessary. It's a thing of the past. We don't need the temple with the Holy of Holies and the curtain, because God, as we see here, God has torn the curtain down. The way into the Holy of Holies has now been opened up. We no longer need the sacrifices and the priests of the Old Testament worship to atone for our sins and enable us to come into the presence of God. Because Jesus has fulfilled everything that is pointed to by those sacrifices and those priests. He has done everything necessary to enable us to come into God's presence. I'll say that again. What we learn from this miracle is that Jesus has done everything necessary to enable us to come into God's presence. That's the main application that we're going to think of this miracle to us this evening. Jesus has done everything necessary to enable us to come into the presence of God. The God who commanded this curtain to be erected tore it down himself following his Son's death on the cross. And he says to us in that, there's nothing more to be done. There's nothing more to be done. My Son, Jesus, in his death, has fully and finally atoned for sin, bridging the gap, bridging the separation between sinners and God. Jesus has done everything necessary to enable us to come into God's presence. There's nothing more that needs to be done other than put our trust in Jesus. His death didn't open up the curtain a little bit. His death didn't rend the curtain from top to 2/3 down, or 2 to 3/4 way down, and we had to do something else to rip it apart. His death tore the curtain asunder completely. Completely. There's nothing more we need to do other than put our trust in him. But sometimes, and this is where we get to our application, sometimes we live as if that curtain still exists, don't we? It might be ripped in two, we think to ourselves, but it still exists, and by our actions, we pull open and close this curtain that grants or hinders our access into God's presence. And we think mentally, whenever we do something wrong, we fall into sin, we disobey God, we let him down, maybe we fail to read our Bible in the morning before we head off to school or work. We don't take that guilt-aged opportunity to share the gospel with our neighbor or our friend. We deny our faith in some way. We lose our temper with a family member. We think to ourselves that we have pulled on the drawstring and we have closed off our access to the presence of God, that our behavior somehow closes the curtain and closes off our access to the presence of God. And we're locked out until we do something to open the curtain again. We look at our Bible reading, or our church attendance, or being a good Christian, or being a nice person. In doing that, we're pulling on the drawstring again, and we're opening up for ourselves our entrance into the presence of God. And we have the mindset that there's things we don't need to, we cannot do. If we do those things, we fall into the trap of doing those things, our access to God's presence is locked off. And by doing things again, earn God's favor, win God's approval, we open up the curtain again and have access to God's presence. We live at times, don't we, with this Old Testament mindset, as if a curtain still exists between us and God, when it doesn't. It doesn't. Questioning at times whether we have done enough. Have I done enough to secure being in the presence of God? Done enough to keep the curtain open to be in God's presence? When the only thing we need to do, is trust Jesus. That's the gospel. Through faith in Jesus and his sacrifice for sin on the cross, the curtain that was barring us from God's presence, it has been torn away, this miracle says, torn away for all of eternity. And as a child of God, there's nothing you can do, there's nothing you have to do, there's nothing you must do that in order to keep that curtain from closing in front of you. There's nothing you have to do to keep that curtain open. There's nothing that you can do that will reverse that process and pull the curtain back across, barring you from God's presence. As a child of God, there's nothing further you must do to keep the curtain open. Jesus, having opened the curtain between sinners and God, the curtain between you and God, having torn apart whenever you put your faith in him, there is nothing you need do as a genuine, trusting child of God to keep that curtain open. Now, that doesn't mean we can live as we please. That's not what I'm saying. And you know that's not what I'm saying. That will be a sign that your claim to trust him might not be genuine. We seek to obey him, and we seek to honor him and live for him, but we don't do that in order to ensure our access into his presence, or out of fear that our access to his presence might be cut off. It can never be cut off. Never. That curtain will never be closed for a genuine child of God. Jesus, having done everything necessary to bring us access into God's presence, access that we have now, today, in this lifetime, a wonderfully renewed relationship with him, access we will enjoy for eternity when we die. We're not, as God's children, to live in fear of losing that access, but in joyful devotion and glad obedience to the one who pulled back the curtain. That's how we're to live. And that's the application for us as children of God, this miracle. And now, the end is near. Not referring to the end of my sermon, though it's true. Those are the opening words of the Frank Sinatra song, My Way. And now, the end is near, and so I face that final curtain. And now, the end is near, and so I face that final curtain. And those words were true not only of Frank Sinatra, they're true of all of us, all of you. All of us face that final curtain. The curtain of death. The curtain that stands, as we saw this evening, the curtain that stands between heaven and hell. We all face that. The curtain that stands between being in God's presence for eternity and being shut out in the outer darkness of hell. We all face that final curtain. And my question to each of you this evening as we close is, what side of that curtain will you be on? What side of that curtain will you be on? And if you're not a Christian this evening, I ask you to ask yourself that question and answer that question with Judgment Day honesty. If you were to die tonight, what side of that curtain would you be on? Are you in? Or are you out? And if you are a Christian, you can face that final curtain with wonderful confidence, with wonderful assurance and wonderful joy in the Savior who has torn it open so that you might pass through. A curtain that he assures us in this miracle he will never shut in your face and bar you out.